Hey folks, hope everyone's doing well today, and let's get started. We're going to pick up where we left off in Chapter 8. So remember in Chapter 8, we were discussing how taxes affect consumer surplus and producer surplus. In Chapter 9, we're actually going to look at the application for market surplus, producer surplus, consumer surplus, and government policy in the context of international trade. And so we're going to look at certain international trade policies and how they can distort the ultimate effect of the ultimate goals of our policy. So let's get started. First off, let's think about the determinants of trade. So we discussed back in chapter 2 about how ultimately there's some easy gains from trade, right? We discussed how in general, if firms and countries specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in, then they're able to get gains of trade in which they're able to push beyond their production possibility frontiers on their own. So in line with this, the equilibrium without is that when there's no trade, the price adjusts to balance domestic demand with domestic supply. Basically, this functions like a typical market and it arrives at domestic equilibrium. And so, if we're not trading, if we're not getting these gains from trade, we're basically just reliant on what's going on in the domestic market. And that means that there's a cap on how much we can achieve. But the market functions like we'd expect a normal market to. Now, the world price basically, though, is that while we have a domestic market and while the domestic market is determining the price of these goods, in reality, the country can possibly might be participating in this market overall. So, for example, we'll have countries, say, producing sugar, and we'll have other countries producing sugar. And so everyone that is producing sugar and then decides to export their sugar, they're now entering a global market. And the global market is affected by what does everyone around the world want of a good versus what does everyone within the country want of the good versus what does the world willing to produce. So to give you an example, oil is sort of the classic case. The world price of oil is the price that pervades around the entire world, and it's usually set by a cartel called OPEC. And this is the price of oil that if any country wants to buy oil and import it from the market, this is the typical price that is prevailing. So, like I said, oil is set by OPEC. So, how do we determine whether or not countries import or export? It's not simply a matter of is this country able to produce something or is this country willing to produce something? We think about comparative advantage in determining this. And one of the ways we can determine comparative advantage is simply to compare the domestic price to the international price. So if the domestic price, let me get the pointer out here, if the domestic price is lower than the international price, it makes sense for countries, typo, bad one. It makes sense for countries to export and sell. So just to give you an example, if the United States can produce oil for $40 a barrel and it can sell and export, it can sell oil at $50 a barrel worldwide, it makes sense for American producers to shift to selling theirs in a global market. Similarly, if the domestic price is greater than the international price, countries should import and buy from international. That if the prevailing world price can sell it cheaper, well, no one's going to buy our producers' goods because if our producers tried to export it, their price would be above the world market. So people just prefer the other countries providing oil at the world market, and our consumers could benefit by purchasing at the international price. And so if the domestic price prevails higher than the international price, we say countries should import and buy from international markets. In practice, what this means is the following. If a nation exports, i.e., if the world price is above the domestic price, let's look what happens. So, first off, let me take out a little drawer here. Let's work through this graph. So, first off, I want us to identify the parts of this graph. So, our domestic price without trade is the line straight through the middle that establishes our domestic equilibrium. That makes sense, right? Our green line is our domestic demand curve, and our red line is our domestic supply curve. Now, the world price, notice here, this red line is above our domestic price. So our domestic price is below it here at the equilibrium, and the world price is above it. Now, what we can do here is I want to just compare for one moment. What was our original consumer surplus? Our original consumer surplus is this area that I am circling here. Well, not circling, but lining. So this was our original consumer surplus. Now, what happens if we sell at the world price is simply, I'll change to a different color than red. We'll change to green. What happens if we sell at the world price, though, is if we sell at the world price, right, what this means is that we are now selling at a price that is above our equilibrium price. So now we are at the green price instead of the equilibrium price. Now, what happens when we move price above equilibrium? Well, let's think about this for a moment. What was our law of supply? Right. The law implies that as price increases, quantity supplied increases. So notice that from our equilibrium, the quantity supplied has increased. And we can draw this out. I'll switch to orange here. So we can see that the orange line kind of symbolizes what our new quantity supplied is with the increased price of the world price. Similarly, we can see that, and we'll use purple for this, that the quantity demanded, according to the law of demand, has to have gone down because we're now operating at a lower price. And so the purple line kind of symbolizes for us the decrease in the quantity demanded. Now, what does this mean? If our companies, like if our domestic producers are now selling at the world price, and this is higher, and this means they're producing all this, right? So the quantity supplied is the orange line. This is how much companies are producing. And similarly, if this is the quantity, if the purple line represents the quantity demanded at the world price, that means we have this gap here. Let me highlight this. So I am going to circle this with yellow. So this little whole area here, right, this little gap here, that means we have a surplus. And what we find is that what happens with the surplus is this surplus is our exports. I'm going to back away from yellow because that looks awful. So let's just type out this in geometry. So the difference between exports equals the quantity supplied at world price minus the quantity demanded at world price. And so in our case, this quantity supplied minus this quantity demanded determines the imports. Now, what does this mean? The exports. What does it mean that this is what we're exporting? Simply put, this. Clear this. At the higher world price, what ends up happening is that producers get this area here shaded in red from consumers. This was originally consumer surplus in our original domestic market, right? So this has transitioned to consumers, and the reason it's transitioned, or not consumers, the reason it's transitioned to producers is that this price has gone up, and so producers are now paying more money or receiving more money from consumers, domestic consumers. So this section here, notice it says loss of consumer surplus, and this is the gain of producer surplus. And again, the reason that now the individuals that are paying domestically that their demand curve and willingness to pay is above the world price, they have to pay more money than they originally were in the domestic market. And so they've lost all this red area to the higher price, the higher world price. Similarly, our producers are going to pick up even more surplus because now they get the surplus of selling at a higher price and also picking up the gains of trade. So the area I've circled in blue, this is the area that the producers gain from exporting. So now that producers are able to sell at a higher quantity and a higher volume, notice that the amount of exports compensates for the loss of quantity supplied originally. So I'll just draw here. We'll use orange lines again to show this. Since this is our new domestic quantity supplied or quantity demanded, and this was our original quantity demanded, at least half in this graph is made up by exports. And then producers also gain this additional segment from exports. And so overall, we get this entire lighter red triangle. That entire lighter red triangle equals the exports and the producer surplus gain from those exports. Now, if we come over here, we can see actually a very similar case for imports, except this time, instead of producers winning, it's going to be consumers who win. So notice here the world price is below the domestic price. Notice that because the world price is below the domestic price, quantity demanded has gone up. That follows the rules of quantity demanded. So we see here quantity demanded by domestic buyers is now this point. And because world price is lower than domestic price, what we find is the quantity produced by domestic suppliers decreases. And so the gap between these 2 points, this little red line, this is going to be the total amount of goods the country imports, the difference between the quantity demanded by domestic buyers minus the quantity produced by domestic suppliers equals the total imports for the country. And similar to how producers gained from the consumer surplus when they exported, in the case of importing, consumers gain producer surplus. And so this darker green section is the gain of consumer surplus and the loss of producer surplus. While the lighter green shaded triangle here, this is our consumer surplus they gain from the imports. Now, there's 2 reasons for this. Notice that half of this triangle comes from the gains of trade in the sense that more people are able to enter the market. And again, let me highlight this. We'll use blue this time. Yep. Notice that at least half of this triangle comes from the fact that more people are buying at a lower price because the lower price elicits more people to participate in the market. And then notice that the other half comes from the fact that these are now goods that were bought domestically but are now being bought as imports. And the consumers that were participating in the market are now paying a lower price on all those additional imports, the import substitutions. Now, we're going to consider a special case, and this is called a tariff. And what a tariff is it is a direct tax on the quantity of a good imported into the country. And so, for example, a tariff might be the US has a tariff on sugar. A tariff might be for every pound of sugar, you have to pay 15 cents. So what that is for every country that would like to export sugar to the United States, and the United States is going to import that sugar, those exporting countries have to pay the US 15 cents to sell their goods in the US market. Now, why would a country consider this? Well, there's 2 reasons. One, because a tariff is a tax, that obviously means the government's going to generate tax revenue. But there's another reason. Notice that, let's just pop back for a moment. Notice that in our previous slide, when a country is importing, who loses? Producers, right? Which gets picked up by consumers. If you push the price up of a good, technically producers could reclaim the surplus they've lost, right? And so that is one of the chief motivations for creating a tariff, is that by creating a tariff, producers are able to claw back some of the surplus and the revenues they've lost due to the country importing. And so just to break this down, I want to work through here. I'm going to highlight in blue our original surplus. So this section here, right, this area that I'm highlighting now, this is our original surplus, our total market surplus. Now I'm going to go back and in red highlight specifically what was producer surplus. This little yellow triangle was the producer surplus in the event of importing. And you might be like, oh, wow, consumers had a ton of the surplus here. And the answer is absolutely, they really did. The world price was substantially lower than the domestic price, and a very small quantity of the goods supplied in the country came from domestic markets. Now, let's say an example of this might be avocados. It's very hard to grow avocados in the United States, and in Mexico, avocados can be grown particularly cheap. Now, you might say, why does the U.S. import so many avocados? Real simple reason. Avocados make guacamole, and by all accounts, Americans really like guacamole. So, in our market, as I said, we're using the example of avocados. In our market, it is very apparent that consumers are really beneficial. But let's just say that an American alliance of guacamole producers comes together, and let's say they call themselves, I don't know, Guacamole. And so Guacamole is protesting and would like to institute a tariff and says that, hey, competition isn't fair. Mexico is able to import or export avocados to the U.S. for much cheaper than we can produce. We'd like to produce our industry. So the U.S. institutes a tax, and the tax and the price of that tax is, and I'll put this in orange, the difference between the price in the tariff and the price of the world market. So this orange right here, that represents the size of the tariff, and that's the price of the tariff per unit. So when the US institutes a tariff, what happens? Let me clear this out. What happens when the US institutes a tariff is it pushes up the price paid in the domestic market. Now, what happens when the price goes up? Right. According to the law of demand, as price increases, quantity demanded goes down. And what do you know? This was our quantity demanded at the original world price, and this is our quantity demanded at the new price with the tariff. So we have this loss, and you can see here we're going to have the deadweight loss, societal loss from the decrease in the quantity demanded for the good due to the high price. But what else happens? Yeah, at a higher price, right? The supply tells us that the quantity supplied will go up. And so we see our quantity supplied in the domestic market increases to this point. And so we have this new intersection at this point that shows us that, yeah, this line and this area is now our domestic producer surplus. And it creates another loss. So this triangle in here, this red societal loss, this tells us how much is lost due to the fact that domestically produced avocados have replaced cheaper avocados we used to import. Now, the end result is that remember that the difference between the price of the tariff and the price of the world, this was the size of our tariff. Well, how can we tell how much our tax revenue? That's actually pretty simple. Highlight it here. How much is our total imports? Well, it's simply the difference between our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied, domestic quantity supplied. So these are our 2 points, which tells us that this area here, this is the length of our imports, and that tells us the total quantity the country has imported. Now, if we want to calculate the tax revenue, all we would have to do then is take the quantity, which I have here, take the quantity of goods imported. Again, that's the difference between the quantity demanded at the price with the tariff and the quantity supplied at the price of the tariff, and then multiply that by the cost of the tariff, which, remember, the price of the tariff is the difference between the price of the tariff the value of the tariff is the difference between the price of the tariff and the price of the world, which tells us that this rectangle here is our tax revenue. So in the event of a tariff, what we find is that, yes, consumer surplus still increases because we still have a few imports, but at the same time, producer surplus significantly increases, much more so than the total surplus, or much less so than the total surplus loss, because we have 2 deadweight losses. And then the government picks up this tax revenue here in the middle. And so what is the purpose of a tariff? Why would we do this if we see that we clearly have social deadweight loss and that the tax revenue and producer surplus gained isn't as much as the consumer surplus loss? Well, now we're going to go through a few reasons over the debate with trade. So again, a tariff is explicitly a tax on imported goods. Only works if importing, right? If I tax exports, all I'm telling my producers is that you have to pay me for you to send your goods abroad. But in reality, governments don't want producers to do that. They actually are happy when producers are exporting, so that wouldn't make much sense. The general trade lessons, though, are that if a domestic price exceeds international price, a country imports. A tariff will only be effective in this case, but the societal loss is greater than the revenue raised from taxation, so free trade is considered a more beneficial policy. Now, if domestic price is lower than the international price, export. Who wins and loses, though? This is a question of whether you're importing or exporting. Importing, this is a benefit to consumers who pay lower prices at the expense of producers who supply less and or exit the market. As a classic example, steelworkers in the Midwest have been one of the groups that are really hit hard by the fact the U.S. has shifted to importing steel from Japan and Germany, for example. However, the fact that the U.S. imports a lot of steel means that goods we use that use steel are much cheaper and sometimes much higher quality. Exports benefit producers, however, because they get to produce and sell more at the expense of consumers, and domestic consumers have to pay higher prices. So, for example, the US exports a ton of engineering expertise, a ton of financial expertise. That means that domestic individuals have to pay a higher price for those goods. Now, there are arguments, there are other benefits of international trade. First off, we have increased variety of goods. Notice that like iPhones and the Google Pixel are designed in the US. However, Samsung and LG are South Korean, HTC is Taiwanese, Sony is Japanese, and so on and so on. Like this tells us that you get a wider variety of goods by trading. Particularly, go back to the example of avocados. The U.S. really is not a great place to grow avocados, and so by trading with Mexico, the U.S. can acquire avocados, create guacamole, uh, other significant benefits. Now, there's also lower costs through economies of scale. So China is becoming a leading skilled producer of technological goods. Even though designs originate in the U.S., iPhones and Pixels are manufactured in China due to lower cost, and that's part of the reason is that as we consolidate technology production in China, that usually means that we have gains of economies of scale as China becomes more refined and focuses, enhances their ability to produce these high technological devices. Additionally, there's increased competition. Again, look at the variety of phone options offered. Why did Apple start offering more cost affordable phones? Well, competitors' brands launched more affordable price point phones that siphoned away potential customers. There was a period where Apple you couldn't buy for cheaper than like $800, $850, $900. And it was climbing up even more. Well, not everyone can pay $900 for a phone. And Apple's competitors knew that and had phones priced at $400, $500, $300, $200. And so Apple had to reshift back down and release more cost effective phones in order to combat their competitors. Similarly, there's an enhanced flow of ideas. Again, the phone industry is a perfect example. Technology and ideas swap across the globe, whether it be design, waterproof, processors, battery glass, etc. And these ideas lead to better products everywhere and originate in multiple countries. A classic example is that 5G, the latest system that cell phones operate on, that technology actually originates in China. So true 5G originated in China, and new phones that are using 5G processors rely on this technology from China. It makes American designed phones better, but it also allows them to operate formally, while China also benefits of learning from US developments in LG and LTE sources as well. Now, what are the arguments for restricting trade? We're going to zoom in here because this is about zoomed out. There's a few. The first is the jobs argument, and this idea is that free trade costs jobs. In reality, free trade creates more jobs while destroying others. Countries specialize, and industries in non-specialized countries struggle while others grow. The issue is that who wins and loses in trade is not even. So we mentioned Ohio steelworkers. Ohio steelworkers are not the people that become New York bankers, and West Virginia coal miners do not become solar engineers in Arizona. What we're trying to say here is that while the country overall is beneficial and while most Americans will benefit, the people that lose their jobs from being in industries that are deemed uncompetitive and do not have a comparative advantage, it is very difficult for those individuals, for whether geographic or skill matching reasons, to transition into other jobs. The national security argument. This is one of the few trade restriction arguments that economists take fairly seriously. This is the idea that this industry is vital to national security. It is a careful balancing act. Certainly, there are reasonable industries to protect, but this can also be weaponized for industries that don't really qualify. U.S. sugar has a huge tariff in its place. It costs Americans about $20 every year, but it's necessary to keep the U.S. sugar industry in Louisiana and Texas afloat. Why do we do this? Well, there's an argument to be made that sugar is a preservative. It's important the U.S. have access to that preservative. But in reality, one of the big things we've seen is the U.S. doesn't use sugar as much as it actually uses corn syrup. And so corn syrup is a big corporate substitute for sugar now. The industry argument is let's let our industries get on their feet, then we can take them on. And the idea is that domestic industries aren't developed enough and will be crushed if they're not allowed to function under some protections. They articulate the idea of temporary trade restrictions. This is difficult to implement in practice. It seemingly picks winners while being heavily influenced by the political process. So, a point in case, there are UAW tariffs and quotas on Japanese cars in the 1970s. Why? Because Japan committed the horrid crime of trying to provide the United States affordable, reliable cars with low fuel costs. Um, the ended up result was Americans paid way more for cars that weren't quite as good. The unfair competition market argument. This is all countries aren't playing by the same rules. It's a producer centric argument. Consumers aren't hurt here. However, we need producers to have jobs, so it's complicated. But again, there's a very long cycle. Economists don't take this particularly, they don't tend to take this argument particularly seriously. One of the major reasons why is that there's a reason why countries don't operate by the same rules. And it seems somewhat imperialistic to demand that all countries adhere to the same rules. And also, there's a debate of, again, why should we pick winners and hurt consumers? Protection as a bargaining chip. This is simply the idea of tariffs so that we can get the rest of the world to accept our tariffs. It's a bad idea. It does not do any good. Countries just retaliate with their own protection policies. If you don't trust this, you should look up the Smoot-Hawley tariff for an example of a protectionist disaster. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was instituted to basically block off other countries, and ultimately it's considered one of the most significant contributors to the Great Depression. Now, that is all we have for today. So we're going to wind up. I highly recommend referencing your textbook as always. Be sure to go back and check and practice the examples for the tariffs. As always, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right, take care. Till next time, y'all